Welcome back, everybody. For our final session, Theologies and Religion in Deep Time 2 will be chaired by Tim Middleton, our conference co-organiser and my fellow PhD student. Tim first trained as an earth scientist and is now midway through his DPhil in the Faculty of Theology and Religion here at the University of Oxford. His current research focuses on Christian theological responses to the notion of ecological trauma. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much indeed, Natasha, and thank you all for staying with us for this final session today. You'll have to forgive us for including two sessions on theologies and religions in deep time. Both Natasha and I work in the theology faculty, and there was so much we wanted to include. We've split the theology and religion over two sessions. So I'm delighted that we've got two brilliant speakers for this last session, and we'll follow the pattern that we have in all of the others. I'll introduce both of them at the start, and then they'll each have about 15 minutes for their paper before they engage in discussion with each other. So our first speaker is Simone Cottfer, who's a postdoctoral research fellow in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oslo, and she's also an affiliated lecturer at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge, where she co-teaches a module on theology in the Anthropocene. She's published widely on spiritualist philosophy, attention, and environmental ethics. Her first book is called Effort and Grace on the Spiritual Exercise of Philosophy, and she's currently working on a co-authored monograph with Alice Tarbuck entitled Spell Work for a Damaged Planet, Magic and Ecology. And then after Simone, we're going to hear from Jeremy Kidwell. Jeremy is a senior lecturer in theological ethics in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham. His work explores the problems facing our civilizations and ecologies from an interdisciplinary perspective. His most recent book, I believe, is called The Theology of Craft and the Craft of Work, From Tabernacle to Eucharist, and he's currently working on a monograph entitled Ecological Reconciliation in the Anthropocene, which examines ways in which different theologies of time are at work in the construct of the Anthropocene. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Simone for our first presentation.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that introduction. Can you hear me all right? Is it a good?
Yes, that's great.
Excellent, wonderful. Okay, so Jeremy and I have been asked to address deep time from the perspective of theologies and religions. Now, theologies, of course, have much to say about time. Christian theology, like other religious traditions, represents a chance to rethink human chronologies, human histories, within more than human temporalities. There are theological theories about time that have a strong bearing on the topic of this conference. So I think Jeremy might be saying something more directly to these theories in a moment. Theology, however, like religious traditions and spiritual practices more broadly, also encourage direct experience, immediate apprehensions of what I just called more than human temporalities. So there are manuals of ecstasy, handbooks of spiritual exercises, and visionary texts that describe in detail the experience of widening ordinary perception to encompass the time of stars and stones. So before we consider theology's theories about time, I wanted to introduce first theology's ways of altering perceptions of time by looking at more than human temporality in ecstasy or religious trance. And I think this is instructive not only from a theological point of view, but also with regard to the concept of deep time as it has developed over the last century. So in the sense it's used today, deep time first appeared in the context of a detailed account of a visionary experience that turns toward theological language as it peers beyond the limits of the human. In J.G. Ballard's 1962 novel, The Drowned World, a lucid dream of Triassic Earth regularly visits the inhabitants of a post-apocalyptic London submerged in water. Chapter 5 is entitled Descent into Deep Time. It relates the protagonist's, Dr. Robert Kieran's, first experience of the dream. The dream transports him to the dawn of mammalian life. Here he finds himself under the eye of an enormous, swollen sun, gliding through the waters of primordial lagoons towards the fatal embrace of a dinosaur. So I'll read you a bit of the opening in Chapter 5, Descent into Deep Time. Later that night, as Kieran's lay asleep in his bunk at the testing station, the dark waters of the lagoon outside drifting through the drowned city, the first of the dreams came to him. He had left his cabin and walked out onto the deck, looking down over the rail at the black luminous disk of the lagoon. Dense pools of opaque gas swirled across the sky only a few hundred feet overhead, through which he could just discern the faint glimmering outline of a gigantic sun. Booming distantly, it sent dull glows pulsing across the lagoon, momentarily lighting the long limestone cliffs, which had taken the place of the ring of white-faced buildings. Reflecting these intermittent flares, the deep bowl of the water shone in a diffused opalescent blur, the discharged light of myriads of phosphorescing animalcula congregating in dense shoals like a succession of submerged halos. Between them, the water was thick with thousands of entwined snakes and eels writhing together in frantic tangles that tore the surface of the lagoon. As the great sun drummed nearer, almost filling the sky itself, the dense vegetation along the limestone cliffs was flung back abruptly to reveal the black and stone-grey heads of enormous Triassic lizards. Strutting forward to the edge of the cliffs, they began to roar together at the sun, the noise gradually mounting until it became indistinguishable from the volcanic pounding of the solar flares. Kieran's felt the powerful, mesmeric pull of the baying reptiles and stepped out into the lake, whose waters now seemed an extension of his own blood. As the dull pounding rose, he felt the barriers which divided his own cells from the surrounding medium dissolve, and he swam forwards, spreading outwards across the black, thudding water. So upon awakening, the flooded landscape and tropical temperatures of a London now half submerged by rising sea levels merge with the surroundings of his dream, exacerbating the effect of the dream by turning it into a waking vision. So this is how Kieran reflects on his experience. Just as the distinction between the latent and manifest contents of the dream had ceased to be valid, so had any division between the real and the super-real in the external world. Phantoms slid imperceptibly from nightmare to reality and back again. The terrestrial and psychic landscapes were now indistinguishable, as they had been at Hiroshima and Auschwitz, Golgotha and Gomorrah. Although Ballard stops short of crossing over into what he describes as an archetypal terrain, a kind of ecstatic temporality, nonetheless his narrative contains gestures that could easily be mistaken for a mystical impulse. Ballard's narrative approaches the threshold of ecstatic religion, not only in its allusions to the dream as a kind of crucifixion scene where terrestrial and psychic landscapes merge, but also in the dream's dissolving of boundaries between nature and supernature, this real and the super-real. During the 1950s and 1960s, this was an aspect of ecstasy and religious trance that was being widely studied, discussed, and popularized for the first time. I find it difficult to read Descent into Deep Time, written in 1962, without calling to mind Mircea Eliade's influential account of the visionary's descent into the underworld in Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, which appeared in French in 1953, nor his many essays on temporality, such as The Myth of the Eternal Return, Cosmos and History, first published in 1954. Although Eliade's comparative method has since been subject to criticism, and I'll be touching on that a bit later, his work remains significant for drawing attention to aspects of ecstasy and religious trance not then widely known to Western readers. So among these aspects is what Eliade defines and identifies as a homology between the consciousness of a person in ecstasy and the resumption of a non-human or purely organic life. For Eliade, the shaman's descent into the underworld resulted in the momentary attunement of human time to the rhythm of organic life as such. Eliade interpreted this homology positively. This was what was so revolutionary about his book. This is how he writes. There was no question of a regression into pure animal life, he explains. By becoming this mythical animal, man became something far greater and stronger than himself. The one who, forgetting the limitations and false measurements of humanity, could rightly imitate the behavior of animals, their gait, breathing, cries, and so on, found a new dimension of life, spontaneity, freedom, sympathy with all the cosmic rhythms, and hence bliss. French word is béatitude, and immortality. So Eliade comes to these observations while conducting a cross-cultural study of ecstatic religion and trance. The prominence of organic life among non-Western forms of ecstatic religion, where not only the quadrupeds so often associated with shamanism are important, but also plants as well as minerals, caused him to take issue with existing scholarship on mystical techniques, really with existing theology. He argued that a narrow focus on Catholic mysticism had caused Western scholars to demonize or at best ignore those parts of its own tradition where the mystic communes with non-human forms of life. Eliade even suggested, and he has since been proven right by several scholars, that in Catholic mysticism, the experience of God ultimately is mediated through an intimate visional contact with non-human creatures, or simply with the elements such as fire, water, or air. As Giorgio Agamben remarks, this is especially true of apocalyptic spirituality, the branch of Christian revelatory theology most closely concerned, of course, with time and the issuing in of a cosmic temporality. So in apocalyptic imagery, God appears in the form of beasts or in the form of elementals, and humans frequently appear depicted with the heads of animals, suggesting, as Agamben writes, the central emptiness, the hiatus that within man separates man and animal. In ecstasy and religious trance, the experience of entering God's temporality cannot be distinguished easily, if at all, from experiencing the time of non-human life. So this same homology we recognize also in Ballard's descent into deep time. Like the shaman in Eliade's account, Dr. Kieran's experiences emerging of earthly with divine temporalities and a diffusion of the merely human, or its expansion into non-humanity that is also more than itself. Moreover, in The Drowned World, what makes the dream significant, for those of you who read it and remember, is that for those who experience the dream in the story, it's not just a dream. So as in Eliade's account, the expansion into non-humanity is not merely figurative here, but real or participatory. So Eliade thinks that the shaman actually does tune into the cosmic rhythms. And in The Drowned World, Ballard has one of Kieran's colleagues, a Dr. Bodkin, I think, explain, it is not a true dream, but an organic memory millions of years old. Total biopsychic recall. We really remember those swamps and lagoons. After a few nights, you won't be frightened of the dreams, despite their superficial horror. But in one important respect, Ballard's account differs from Eliade's. Although The Drowned World depicts the descent into deep time as a fundamentally blissful, ecstatic experience, it's not without its ambiguities. Ballard depicts it as horror, a nightmare as much as an apocalyptic revelation. The descent into deep time reconciles Dr. Kieran's to his non-human self, but precisely for this reason, it also risks negating that which allows him to have the sort of agency that could help others and himself to co-inhabit the earth in its changing form, as we see happening towards the end of the book. So unlike other characters also subject to the dream, such as Beatrice Dahl, his love interest, Dr. Kieran's does not, in the end, travel to join the surviving human remnant on Greenland, but abandons himself to the warming lagoons where he knows he will quickly die. For Eliade, the ecstatic merger with all the cosmic rhythms is identified unequivocally with a necessary abandoning or negation of human consciousness. This suggests a kind of spiritual escapism that glosses over too quickly what many anthropologists since Eliade have labored hard to convey, the practical, indeed political, role of ecstasy and religious trance in communities where it is still functional. And it's part of the story is, of course, that Eliade was an armchair anthropologist. So for this reason, the anthropologist Eduardo Viveros de Castro chooses to describe ecstatic techniques as communicative and critical rather than as merely beatific. So while the techniques of ecstasy constitute for Castro a widening of human perception that results in ecstasy, it does not result in the escape from human perception. Rather, the contact with more than human temporalities results in what he calls a transversal communication between incommunicables, a dangerous, delicate comparison between perspectives in which the position of the human is in constant dispute. So if we apply this thinking to The Drowned World, we might say that the blissful experiences facilitated by the descent into deep time and the resumption of more than human temporalities that it affects are secondary to the inter- and intraspecies cohabitation that the descent makes possible. So I'm arguing that it has a kind of pedagogical role in the narrative. Although Dr. Kierans is privy to a beatific vision that shows the falsity of human chronology when it is considered exclusive and exceptional, the non-human time to which he escapes is not without its own exclusivity and exceptionalism. So in other words, we should be looking not at Dr. Kierans, but perhaps at Beatrice Dahl here as a kind of model for thinking with deep time. So because while Dr. Kierans has an experience of what Eliade would recognize as something shamanic, he's not a shaman in Castro's sense of the word, that is, his ecstasy is not political. At the same time, other characters in the story do eventually engage in something close to the transversal communication described by Castro. And it's in this way, I think, Ballard's mystical impulse becomes significant as an opening for theologians to engage with deep time, but also for the thinking around deep time to engage with theology. Because it reflects not only the possibilities, but also the impossibilities and dangers which spirituality make possible in a largely desacralized world, and which, of course, deep time makes possible when it is a secularized form of spirituality. So yeah, those are my thoughts on deep time, and I think I'll hand over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Simone, and thanks, organizers, for this opportunity to share with you and to chat a bit about our discipline. I need to offer some disingenuous apologies to our colleagues in the other disciplines, because of course, theology and religious studies is not pure. So I'll be transgressing on your disciplinary territory today. So there's that. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a few slides for kicks, if that's all right. There we go. Everybody see that all right? All right, deep time it is. So I'd like to start off today with the 7th century, where we find ourselves with an English Benedictine monk in the north of England, who's now known as the Venerable Bede, who wrote a tome which he titled An Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Now, though our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, might want to lay claim to this title, it was actually this major work which earned Bede the title Father of English History. Now, Bede shows some sensitivity to the topic of deep time and the clearing that it opens up towards reckoning with temporality at the level of landscape, at least. He opens with geography in this book, and not ecclesiology, or maybe he thinks ecclesiology is geography. But this quickly lapses into a sort of medieval tourist brochure where he attempts to advertise the familiar virtues of England for Latin speakers, and we might presume a continental audience. The climax of Bede's history is the Synod of Whitby in 664, where the king of the Kingdom of Northumbria declares that his kingdom will abandon Celtic practice and instead calculate the date of Easter and various monastic customs in coordination with Rome. Now, this might sound like a strange little parochial dispute, but the date of Easter was kind of one of the major chronological disputes of Christian theology across several centuries. So like Eusebius before him, a key theme of Bede's work in general is the portrayal of divine presence and action in history. So Bede tells history not just for the sake of preserving data, but to show an instance of what the historian Walter Goffert calls providence-guided advance of a people. So Bede gives us an example of the enduring ways that Christianity has mobilized history as a device for coordinating divine action with the onward march of human civilization across the full span of time. Bede's and Eusebius's work is a touchstone for a range of contemporary historical theologians. I've given you a few there. This includes David Bebbington, who seek in a similar way to probe the traces of the past for divine action. And indeed, this has been a preoccupation of most Christian civilizations, whether they're seeking to show their own appointment or conversely, their vulnerability to judgment and divine sanction. Indeed, I think, though we do not often talk about it this way explicitly in theological circles, I think history is a key theological tool and arguably is probably mobilized more often than doctrines like providence or creation or eschatology in terms of Christian thinking on time. So in my presentation today, what I want to reflect just briefly on is a problematic theological use of history. And I want to use that in order to point towards some alternatives. And the key kind of idea here is just that our time tools are not trivial. So the metaphors that we use have a different kind of political ecology and philosophical freight. And here I'm chiming in with Michel Bastian's caution about the use of deep time as a metaphor, which sort of might bring some things that we don't expect. I think particularly on this matter, there are some interconnections between Black critical theory and environmental philosophy on the matter of history, which don't get very much notice. And so one of my goals today is to bring some voices from Black theology and Black critical theory forward to you, just for this discussion of history. Now, he's surely no great theologian, but Boris Johnson does provide a helpful example of the kind of thinking that I want to criticize in a speech that he delivered over Twitter about a year ago. And this was in response to activists destroying monuments or liberating ideologies, depending on your perspective, which were devoted to British slaveholders and white supremacists. And of course, Boris here found himself afraid that his own personal hero, Winston Churchill, might also be the subject of activist work. So here's what he said on June 12th, just over a year ago. The statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square is a permanent reminder of his achievement in saving this country and the whole of Europe from a fascist and racist tyranny. It is absurd and shameful that this national monument should today be at risk of attack by violent protesters. Now, whether it was or not is actually in dispute, but nonetheless. Just to fast forward here, he claims that we cannot now try to edit or censor our past. We cannot pretend to have a different history. The statues in our cities and towns were put up by previous generations. They had different perspectives, different understandings of right and wrong, but those statues teach us about our past with all its fault. To tear them down would be to lie about our history and impoverish the education of generations to come. Now, I mean, you can read the rest if you like, but I'm not going to belabor the point. We've all heard enough of Boris Johnson, I suppose. But what I want to note, just for right now, is his deliberate recharacterization of peaceful Black protesters as violent. And I want to note how ironic this is, given the fleet of violent white supremacists who descended on London that same day, shortly before he delivered his speech. But setting that aside, I also want to draw attention to Johnson's use of singular nouns and pronouns. Notice how he speaks of our past and our history as if there is only one history. And I think here we find the temporality of white supremacy, which sets up a single hegemonic past narrative. And then this past narrative then facilitates the delegitimization and suppression of histories of oppression behind a faux monolith. There's a sense here of collective history without plurality. And furthermore, there's a sense that this sort of imagined collective history is fragile and requires defense. Now, other histories are delegitimized in this way of thinking through re-narration. And Paul Gilroy argues this in his book, After Empire, as sins of past crimes relating to former generations. So we have to keep the monument, Forrest argues, because it will remind us of how enlightened the present white generation is through remembering how the wartime generation were a bit racist. So these histories are suppressed through the destruction of bodies and documentary evidence as well, as when white labor and white conservative party officials facilitated the destruction of Windrush landing cards in 2009 and 2010, which then provided the basis for deportation of legal citizens of the UK. And it's especially important to appreciate this today because we've just had Windrush Day just a couple of days ago. So the question I want to use Boris's moment to ask is, why and how is this myth of a single history so persuasive? Now, I won't have much time to really follow on in this talk. Maybe we can get it in the questions, but I want to signpost how this discussion is relevant to the wider discussion, because as long as this kind of history is unconfronted, I think the myth will distort or impair our attempts to engage with deep or ecological times. And so I want to take the rest of my time here to point out some ways that Black counter-historiographies offer some useful insights and alternatives for us. Now, the question is particularly important for us to consider here today because awareness, I think, of racism is far more suppressed and invisible in Europe than it is in the USA. The poet and essayist James Baldwin offers an important rejoinder to Boris's historiography about a half a century ago. So this comes in an interview that he gave just after the assassination of Martin Luther King, where the interviewer asks him in sort of 1960s style, "Can we just cool it, man?" So here's what Baldwin said in response. He said, "It's a very serious question in my mind, whether or not the people of this country, the bulk of the population of this country, have enough sense of what is really happening to their Black co-citizens to understand why they're in the streets. I know of this moment, they maybe don't know it, and this is proved by the reaction to the civil disorders." You see the rejoinder to Johnson here, right? And then he goes on to say, all that can save you now is your confrontation with your own history. So you notice how there's a different construction of history there. He's a shifted historiography. So I think quite important for our discussion here is Baldwin's recognition of the collusion between history and theism. That is, we defend white history at the same time that we defend white religion and call it Christianity. There are crucial questions, I think, for us to ask here about the notion of tradition as well and its intertwining with white history. But I'll just sort of leave that laying there for now. What I want to get into now and heading towards concluding is the work of the French Caribbean writer, poet, philosopher, and literary critic Eduard Glassant. Glassant is thinking as well in the same kind of problem that Baldwin's referencing here, and he calls this non-history. Glassant argues, well, he calls for a better philosophy of history, which can still do the restorative and creative work of collective memory. So here we have a similar kind of reference to collective memory that Johnson is trying to invoke, but a different kind of collective memory, because Glassant observes that our different histories, just like our different social experiences, can vary quite widely in their constitution. And the key point here, in terms of the way he's mobilizing Black critical thought, is that Afro-Caribbean history is not linear in the way that white history tends to present itself. He describes it as a history characterized by ruptures. So there's a dialectic that Glassant is arguing for, echoing W.B. Du Bois, between pluralism and cosmopolitanism, which arises from what Du Bois called double consciousness, which was a reference to the state of unreconciled strivings, as he called them, between Black nationalisms and various forms of globalism, including Black Pan-Africanism, particularly as it arose in the early 20th century. So what we're looking for here is a kind of restorative and creative work of collective memory, which is nonetheless inherently pluralistic. So I'm aware that I'm just about out of time here, and I want to leave plenty of an opening here for Q&A and discussion, because I've got some questions for Simone as well. But I want to just give you maybe two tentative suggestions here on the back of some of these folks that I've introduced you to. And this is towards thinking about sort of, if we want to think critically about history and recognize some of the problematic ways in which particularly Christian theology has used providential history, and try to think about history in a broader way, in a way that might be opened up to other than human forms of life and other than human forms of temporality. This is a sort of fusion maybe of environmental history and Anthropocene histories. There's just two suggestions that I want to consolidate for you. So the first one is that I think the Black philosophy of history that I've been pointing to here has quite a lot to offer us. In similar ways, to be fair, that feminist work in time studies has also brought, in terms of retemporalizing the biosphere. So if we are to reimagine the intersection of our various temporalities with those of other than human creatures, we might as well begin by connecting our hegemonic faux histories with the violence they have underwritten. So I think it's appropriate to suggest that this insight might also extend into environmental history. So it's not just about the ways that Christian theologies, Christian histories have underwritten slave ownership, for example, but also some of the ways that natural histories have underwritten the oppression of other than human forms of life. And particularly in as much as those histories are attempting to be a kind of hegemonic singularity. So I think we can take this point forward, and again, looking to Black theology, James Cone makes exactly this argument in his essay, Whose Earth Is It Anyway? So there's a good reference for folks to chase down if you haven't read James Cone on this. So I think the first point there, we're looking for a kind of repentance and epistemological clearing. And so I think the next step beyond that then would be to pursue the kind of creative resynthesis that Glassant commends. And I want to suggest that this is a way of doing history. So this is not an alternative to history, but we could conceive of history and therefore the kind of thing that we're weaving into theological reasoning. So can we do history in a way that is collective and creative? Now, it's often nice to point to Gregory Bateson as a thinker who helps us here, who talks in 1970 about the ways we need to kind of rehabilitate our epistemologies. He talked about pursuing patterns that reconnect. But I think we can go back a bit further than that and appreciate the ways that Martin Luther King Jr. argued for something quite similar in an idea that he called the beloved community. And particularly in King's 1967 Christmas sermon, he argued, and this is in King's words, sorry, I don't have it on the slide. It really boils down to this, he said, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So I'm nowhere near answering any of the questions that I've raised here. I guess that's the point. I get to be provocative. But I think I've strewn some hints along the way. I think there's some merit to what Gadamer called, following Husserl, the fusion of our narrative horizons. But I think the mode of work that we need to undertake here in terms of thinking with the other, in terms of our temporality and our time reckoning, is more complex and more dynamic. And because each of those different horizons are swarming with lots of different temporalities. So I think what we need is a work that is embodied and affective. What does history feel like? And finally, I think this work focuses in on the network and not just the nodes. How do our stories connect us? How might plants tell stories about our modes of care and responsibility? So I'll leave it there and I'll look forward to hearing what you've got in the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much, Simone and Jeremy, for your presentations. There's a huge amount for us to get into. Just to mention to the attendees, feel free to start putting questions into the Q&A box, and we'll come to those in a moment. But before we do, Jeremy, you've already mentioned that you had some questions for Simone. I don't know if you want to kick off with those, or Simone, if you wanted to respond to Jeremy's paper. Feel free, whichever of you wants to start the discussion.
Jeremy, why don't you kick off with some questions?
Oh, fine. Sure. I just want to really just affirm all the things that you said. I'm not sure I want to question any of it. I think I'm especially keen on this notion of mystical, the mystical and the shamanic space as a space for kind of time reckoning. And maybe I could ask you to chat just a little bit more about the myth of the eternal return, because you didn't talk too much about it. But there is this kind of fetishization of cyclical time by white Western anthropologists in particular. Maybe Richard will want to chime in on this too. But I wonder if a lot of people really love the myth of the eternal return. It's a kind of signpost for a lot of this kind of reflection. But I think what you were trying to do there was point out some of the kind of flaws, and you alluded briefly, but didn't really unpack some of the problems. I wonder if you could just chat a little more about that and why we might want a different type of shamanism or a different framing of shamanism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks. I think we both are trying to, although we're speaking from the perspective of our disciplines, we're also kind of oddly not really speaking from them. We're trying to decolonize them, I guess, and show how engaging with deep time is impossible to do without that kind of reckoning with the discipline, staying with the trouble of our disciplines, basically. And so, I see mysticism, ecstatic religion, pointing to those aspects of the experience of being human, which in particularly a certain kind of Western epistemology have simply been written out of what it is to be human, with the result that you then have a sort of positive feedback loop, right? If being human is construed narrowly as some kind of, I don't know, active awareness, consciousness, then everything that's outside of that, which might be in human experience, is suddenly not actually human. And it's a very, very odd thing that's happened in terms of how epistemology has shaped like our conceptions of time. So Eliade's work was really important for widening that, but at the same time, it wasn't actually based on engaging with the localities where these things become like what Bateson would call like kind of ecologies of attention, right? And so although we have to kind of acknowledge, you know, the history of that, the history of like Eliade's role in that, and sort of Ballard as a response to that, when we're dealing with it today, we can't do so naively. So if we want to widen our perception in this way, by kind of allowing the mystical impulse, as it were, to act as a kind of decolonization of theology from within, then we have to also engage with, I think somebody else mentioned the kind of a need for empiricism in our disciplines. And this is kind of where theology becomes empirical, is in engaging with those who have experiences of the more than human world. And of course, increasingly in a desacralized sort of Western world, those persons will not necessarily be Christians. I mean, the reality of Christian religion is that most people do not report or write about a participation in more than human realities. And so if we want to take seriously like living, what does it like to be human in a more than human world and engaging in more than human temporalities, then that's the sort of, that's the empiricism that we need to engage in. And so the problems there with Eliade is that he applies to all of these different, what are sometimes called indigenous epistemologies, a kind of blanket definition. And he sort of applies a kind of romanticized, late romantic Nietzschean idea to them. And I think, though, I think Nietzsche is actually more sophisticated in his understanding of what the eternal return might mean, because for him it's a kind of a return not to, I mean, it's a return of chaos, right? It's a turn of like particularity and locality, and it constantly disrupts. What is returning is not the same. What is returning is like difference again and again, which is why Deleuze liked Nietzsche's idea of the concept of the eternal return and was not particularly interested in Eliade. So the alternative trajectory of, the alternative understanding of shamanism that I was trying to get at, it is based on anthropologists reading the myth of the eternal return through Deleuze and Guattari, actually quite a lot. So Castro is reading anthropology through Deleuze and Guattari via Nietzsche then, instead of Eliade, but it's the same things, and it would have been impossible without Eliade's kind of first sort of writing of these themes.
Yeah, just to kind of leap off from a couple of things you said there, I think I agree with you on Nietzsche, and it's interesting how many Nietzscheans have been turning to process theology and process philosophy as an option, like William Conley, for example. Yeah. His book World of Becoming is doing the sort of thing I think that Eliade really kind of wanted to do but didn't really pull off, but he's gone back to kind of Nietzschean ethics in a way, although I'm not sure how far I want to go with Nietzsche in the end. But the other thing that I really want to emphasize in what you've just said there is the need to take religion seriously on its own terms, which we really don't find very often, particularly in interdisciplinary spaces, because I think we're working with quite stereotypical notions and quite dated notions of religious belonging and belief and participation. And I think more and more, particularly in the environmental humanities, we need to work with a much wider definition of religion, which will include unbelief, which will include hybrid forms of belief, and can help us to acknowledge that Christianity and animism are not always different things, you know, and that there are these kinds of antinomies which we can preserve when we're working with kind of 1950s stereotypes. But in actual practice, there's quite a lot of complicated things going on, which, I mean, lots of people aren't really working with what we would describe as doctrine. So, you know, we're working with kind of lived everyday religion and practice, which is more of a bricolage, and which has really quite sophisticated forms of time reckoning embedded in it.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about that because we're just sitting around and talking about, I guess, maybe some of the more regular themes. Yeah.
So we're starting to get a few questions coming in. I don't know if there was anything you wanted to pick up from Jeremy's paper, Simone, or if you're happy.
Endless thoughts, but maybe we should start picking up questions from the chat.
So there's one coming in here, well, one for each of you, from Kate Rigby. So to Simone first, Kate says, I'd love to hear more about Christian apocalyptic visionary communion with animals. If you're able to say anything about that, Simone.
Yeah. So there's a lovely book by George Agamben called The Open Man and Animals, where he writes specifically about some visionary representations, visual representations of you know, the Great Sabbath, sort of the time after this time, where the banqueters have the heads of beasts. But I've been quite interested in not just in biblical apocalypse, but in biblical apocalypse, but not necessarily the apocalypses that are included in the recension of the Bible we're familiar with in the West now. But so, for instance, in the apocalypse of Enoch, I mean, there's quite a lot of encounters with divinity through kind of pure elements as well, like fire and wind, water, and so on. These are also kind of they're acknowledged as metaphors, but they're not really acknowledged as kind of phenomenologies of religious experience, as it were, and like what that might mean to the religious experience. Essentially there's a structural homology between the non-human organic and the non-human spiritual that happens, especially in apocalyptic texts and in mysticism more broadly, which on the one hand like reaffirms a kind of difference between the human and the non-human, even though the non-human is broadened. But because the mystical text is about what Agamben calls this like emptiness between the human and the non-human, or where the human, you know, merges with the non-human, that becomes really important, because what the mystic is merging with is God, I guess you could say, but it's really the more than human. And it's often represented visually and experientially as organic life. It's a really fascinating aspect of the tradition, which has been largely forgotten, and which a decolonization of theology really immediately lays bare, because that's the first thing that strikes you when you start reading theology from a sort of non-Christian, non-Western, or non-Abrahamicist perspective, I suppose, is that suddenly non-human organic life is really difficult to disentangle from non-human spiritual life.
Brilliant, thank you. And then a question also from Kate for Jeremy this time. She says, recalling that the early conception of environmental or eco-justice emerged from largely Black Christian activism, was justice for all creatures, not just humans. She says, in line with Martin Luther King's vision of beloved community, that's a quote. Can you say something more about current Black theologies in relation to this?
Yes, I can. Hi, Kate. It's weird that we can't see each other. It just feels, anyway. But yeah, thanks for the question. This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot over the past couple of years. I've been learning a lot from an environmental psychologist, Charles Ogunbode, who's based at the University of Nottingham, who's been doing some field work with environmental NGOs in Britain. I think, so this is a roundabout answer, but I will get to it directly. It's just really important to appreciate, as I mean, a lot of us are activists, academics, I think, that environmental work is one of the most default white spaces professionally that you will find in Europe. In fact, if you look at the actual careers data, the least diverse occupational category is environmental science of any, I mean, we're talking law, business, anything, it's environmental science. So so I've been trying to sort of explore what's going on there, and in talking to a lot of white executives and leaders, I often hear the refrain that we'd really like to include more Black voices, but there's just not that much out there. Either Black communities aren't interested in the environment, or they're just trying not to get killed by the police, and they've got those kinds of things to worry about, which is a really plausible thing to say. But it's this thing I've learned from Charles and Dorcetta Taylor, who's at the University of Michigan, did a similar kind of study for the USA on a much bigger scale. It's just not true. Actually, communities of color are much more concerned about the environment, much more likely to act on things like climate change, and have much richer, to be honest, traditions of response, both scholarly, artistic, and at the kind of popular level. So there's just a ton there, and I'm sure David Ferrier's nodding his head somewhere around here anyway, because this has been a regular refrain in post-colonial thought as well. So what's interesting to me is that there's been a lot of decolonization in many disciplines, but theology has been rather slow and late to the party. So that's one of the reasons that I really focused on Black scholars. And it's so interesting, if you just look for a few minutes, you'll realize that a Black scholar said it first in just about any of these themes on Deep Time, actually. We just don't reach quite far enough. So in terms of thinking about current Black theologies, there's so much. I mean, Cameron Carter is at the university, well, he's at the University of Indiana now. I know he's working on a book on ecopoetics right now, which will be fantastic. I don't think it's out. Give it a few months. But I think there's quite a lot, as you allude, Kate, and that womanist theologies, I think Black womanist theologies have picked up, drawing on King's very expansive vision. I mean, we think about King as a civil rights campaigner, but of course he was campaigning against the war in Vietnam. He was a pacifist, and he was really thinking about pacifism in a quite global way, in a way that a lot of other activists weren't necessarily. So that's very intrinsic to his thought. Same thing with James Cone, right? We think of James Cone as a kind of radical Black theologian, and we don't appreciate that he also spoke out on environmental concerns. In fact, he wrote one of the earliest essays on the topic, actually, in general in theology. So there's lots of different directions to go. There's been a suppression of those voices, I think, but also I think there's been a real clearing of activist spaces that needs to be addressed. I mean, you look at the staff of NGOs, and it's very obvious what's going on, which is that Black voices and people of color are being excluded from those spaces. And this is part of why, at the end, I was really thinking about the ways we need to think about the legacies of violence and exclusion, because they're very real, and they weren't in the 1950s, like Boris Johnson wants us to think, and has tried very hard to erase the kind of present existence of institutional racism. I should probably stop so we can get to other things, but yeah, something.
Can I add a name to that list?
Yeah, please.
I was just thinking of Willie Jennings at Yale.
Yeah, of course.
He's working on a book that I can't wait to see in print.
It's gonna be amazing.
Yeah, so he's working on an environmental theology, and when I last heard him speak, he was talking a lot about indigenous epistemologies as well. And I think that one of the problems in this idea that environmental theology, for instance, is very white, which it is. It's the kind of self-presentation of environmental theology, but in fact, yes, of course, there's a long history of like indigenous thinking, articulated environmental kind of like ecologies of perception, and that's not white necessarily. I mean, so, but that's not perceived as theology. But what I mean, this is why we need to also like defamiliarize what theology is in order to make sense of it in environmental terms as a discourse of the more than human, not just, I don't know, a certain cultural concept of God. Yeah. So.
It's worth adding just one more thing to that, which is that Robert Beckford has just taken up a chair at the University of Winchester and is going to be doing I think most of his time working on a climate justice project there, which should be pretty amazing as well. If anyone wants a bibliography, I've got it quite long, but I'm happy to share.
So we've got a couple more questions that have come in. One that's a very broad question, which I think could apply to all panelists today. So I'll save that one for the end maybe, but that's the question from Matthew French, if you want to read it in advance. But I'll go now to the question from Luke Bateman. And he says, Jeremy, you mentioned everyday religion, i.e. away from more official doctrines. often has unique and entangled relationships with the environment and ways of time reckoning. I'd be interested to hear you both speak more on this. And this actually chimes with a question that was in the back of my mind when you were talking, Simone, particularly about ecstatic and mystical experiences. There's sometimes a concern that there's an elitism around mystical experience, right? Like it's only accessible to a few, but if that's the way we open up these alternative temporalities, is that a problem? Or are there this everyday religion? Are there ways that very prosaic religious practices can also open up these temporalities for us? So I don't know who would like to go first on everyday religion.
I can say something about elitism.
Great.
And then Jeremy can jump in more on everyday religion. No, just because it was on my mind as you were asking a question. Yeah, so that's why I brought in Castro's interpretation of shamanism, which I think is really, really important at the end. So Eliade, as much as he helped the West to kind of decolonize itself to a certain extent, it also colonized again the idea of what a shaman is, and was interested and turned it into this kind of elite pursuit of secret knowledge and so on. And what Castro does is he really tries to show the kind of social and political role of the shaman. It doesn't, negate the fact that, of course, everyone is not a shaman, right? But in the same way that, like, well, everyone is not a novelist. I mean, but that doesn't mean that the kind of the knowledge that they are privy to is somehow a question of power, right? It doesn't have to be. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And this is what Castro is really interested in. That what the shaman does is negotiates and actually co-inhabits. Right, and that can be misused and is often abused, and especially in like the way mysticism is used and weaponized in the West is an example of that, right? So it can be, but it doesn't have to be. And that's why there's this the recent research on the way in which like ecstatic experiences allow for this kind of blurring of boundaries, which do not necessarily have to take place in like a monastery, for instance, right, is really important, because although it may not be something that you experience every day, it isn't something which is not a part of your human experience still, right? And I think that, I don't know, Jeremy, what your experience is, but like everyday and lived religion is about learning how to cultivate a kind of average perception of things which can be experienced in intense degrees, but to recognize that they're kind of always there. And so when we study lived religion and communities where ecstatic experiences are still functional, so I'm thinking particularly of like the ATRs and the African traditional religions of the diaspora, for instance, where ecstatic experiences have a functional role. It's not just something like you go to see in like special, it has a functional role, right? And yes, it's something that but the community gathers together to see it happen and to interact with it and use it to kind of to co-inhabit the land better. And that's what I'm sort of talking about, which is that yes, these experiences have a special place, but they're also functional, right? They're about co-inhabiting, and it's that kind of balance which I think we've kind of lost sight of a bit when we deal with these experiences.
I mean, I think what you're getting at there is kind of the problem with Durkheim on some level,
yeah.
Which is that this desire to talk about religion as something exotic, sacred, set apart, and truly not part of the ordinary every day, because by its very nature, it can't be in the way that he constructs it. It's interesting to see how lots of Durkheim's interpreters, like Anne Taves, for example, I mean, they do some nice repair work. I think I like Anne Taves's account of special things, which can be taken quite broadly in terms of what is kind of a valid expression of religion or religious experience along those lines. I wanted to just ask you about Castro, because one thing that's always struck me about Amerindian anthropology of religion in particular is that there's quite a harshly materialist frame that most of those scholars are doing. Like, I mean, we want to say religion is valid in as much as it has kind of political traction and it mobilizes people, but the actual content of what people are experiencing isn't really valid. That's always kind of struck me about that scholarship. They take it seriously in terms of its social effects, but are completely unwilling to take it seriously as it kind of meaningful and actual phenomena.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd say that Castro is quite, I guess his appeal to somebody who is a theologian, after all, is because he takes very seriously the experience of spirits as spirits. So he really applies a kind of spirit model to shamanism, where most accounts of ecstasy and religious trance apply a psychological model, and treating it as psychopathology. And he doesn't, he treats it as an interaction.
Fair. So he's less bad on some level. He's less bad in terms of the way because Eduardo Cohn is an interesting example of someone who does take it seriously. Like, you experience a trance and it does something important. It's not because you're crazy, but I don't think something real is actually happening there.
Yeah. That's very common. Like Ernst Arbman, who writes 3 volumes on ecstasy and religious trance, essentially takes that is like, this is real. At the same time, it's not real. I mean, it's a very confusing perspective. I think Isabel Stengers has a really good article called "Reclaiming Animism."
Yes, it's so good.
It's so great, which really gets to the bottom of what we were trying to do. She borrows this idea of reclaiming from the American witch and activist Starhawk, Miriam Simos, who uses it to try and make sense of what modern witches do when they call themselves witches. I mean, they're recovering the witch, but at the same time, they're not trying to culturally appropriate witches who actually died and burned, because we're something different. But at the same time, and she's saying that when Western, and not even just Western scholars, when scholars get excited about animism and do what we're doing today, like get excited about something which is different, what's happening and what's going on. And this is good, yes, to a certain extent, but can very easily go south. And so it's about sort of balancing it. She sees Castro as someone who is a very good example to follow, I guess.
That's fair.
And because of precisely this, like he takes it's not that he writes, he tries to claim that he's animist or that he's a shaman, but he writes as if the spirit world that the shaman interacts with mattered. And I think that's the key thing. That's what we have to do also as theologians, even within our own tradition. We may not have experienced the more than human world, but we need to write about those who have as if it mattered.
Yeah, this is a nice segue for me to address Luke's question more directly, which is just to say that I spent 3 years on a research project when I was at Edinburgh, where we drove around talking to people in eco-churches, sort of asking them why they care about climate change. And this is one of the things that systematic theologians find really devastating, actually, when they get out into the real world, is that most religious people don't really give a crap about doctrine. They don't even know what it is. So you find this in social scientific studies of like Pope Francis' Laudato Si, which is a marvelous, beautiful, important document, but most Catholics have never heard of it. And it had absolutely it had no impact whatsoever on everyday Catholic opinions, because Gallup actually did an opinion poll on this to sort of see with Catholics in America before and after Laudato Si, was there any kind of shift in attitudes around climate change? And it was actually a negative shift. So I don't think that was because of Laudato Si, it was just because no one knew about it, because everyday Catholics don't read what the Pope writes. They couldn't care less. They don't even know how to find it. The same thing with lots of these people that I was interviewing in eco-churches. We were thinking, is there some kind of aspect of the Christian tradition that is being mobilized that's useful in terms of time reckoning? So you ask people, sort of, what are kind of the tools, or what do you think about climate change? They'll talk about IPCC reports for half an hour. And then maybe when they get a bit tired of talking about that stuff, they kind of look around for a bit of doctrine. But really, it was very seldom did we find the case that someone sort of talked about Christian doctrine. What came up was everyday religion. So thinking about generations and children and family and community and place and attachment to land. And I think because of the ways that Christian theology has constructed itself, in terms of some of the binaries, particularly in terms of not pagan, not New Age, not animist, we're in a real bind in a lot of ways, because people don't feel like they can lay claim to modes of thought which are very helpful and which are at hand and which they are actually working with. They just, you can't admit it, because then that would be some sort of challenge to your religion. So it's the purification of religions, I think, as Latour would describe it, which creates a lot of problems for an ethnographer, because people don't feel safe to talk about kind of what they're actually using in terms of the tools of religion and spirituality to talk about these kinds of challenges. But we did actually find in a lot of cases was that people working in a very ad hoc way with whatever was at hand, and what I would probably describe as, well, Tonya Lerman is really good on this, because she points out the way that magical thinking is actually at work across a whole range of different types of religion, including many which would not be comfortable admitting that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
So the real challenge for the theologian, I think, is to find some ways to help people to talk about the hybridity and the kind of complexity and plurality of their religious experience, which is why I like these kind of different kinds of historiographies, more plural ones. In some
and
ways.
To recognize that sometimes a non-religious, what Michel de Certeau called a non-religious exegesis of religion, may be able to reveal that which theology has forgotten about itself. Because the ecological thinking is theological territory for sure. I think both of us could agree on that and have tried to show that. It's theological territory for sure, but it's also, it's a biome that is threatened by theology itself. This is why theology matters, and why environmentalism more and more is shifting into a kind of theological language by talking about the more than human, which is essentially a way of talking about spirits and gods.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can just kind of apply theological language to these questions, right? Because it's being threatened by theology itself.
And there's a real challenge in these kinds of creative and playful spaces, which again, Stengers does a really nice way of framing this up. Which is that we can reach, especially white privileged intellectuals, and appropriate tools without really thinking about the kind of cultural ecologies in which they exist and come from. Yeah. So this is why I really appreciate the way that you're highlighting careful anthropology as a way of understanding what's going on the ground in its kind of full scope, and not just thinking, oh, I'd like that cyclical time over there. You know, I'll sort of grab that thing and kind of work with that.
I'm loath to interrupt a very interesting conversation, but I am conscious of time. So there is a request, Jeremy, to see more of your bibliography. I don't know if you're able to put that in the Q&A box, or just a few ideas. We'll keep the room open after the conference if you want to do that then. I did promise to read out this interesting question from Matthew French, which I think applies to a lot of what we've been talking about all day. And he says, doesn't the act of putting the adjective deep to work on temporality just fix a singular and human perspective in a closing rather than an opening way? Time might, for example, not be comparably or coherently deep from the perspective of limestone, as contrasted with basalt. So I thought that was an interesting question to end on. I don't know if either of you have a 10-second reflection you wanted to offer in response to that, but then we really do have to close, I'm afraid.
10 seconds. Simone, you got anything? Here's a strap line. The thing that might help us an awful lot would be if we stopped doing systematic theology, please.
Great. Okay, we are going to have to wrap up there, but thank you both so much for really, really interesting papers and discussions. I am briefly now going to hand back over to Natasha to say a few more thank yous about the conference in general before we finish.
So with that, we come to the end of the Humanities in Deep Time conference. We hope you have found it insightful, and as Tim said earlier, a way to understand the very long-term impacts of human activities on the environment. The scale of planetary damage currently being caused by human behaviour is a concern to many of us here today. Thank you to all the speakers and the chairs for their wonderful presentations and questions, and to Jade Cuttle for judging and representing the eco-poets of time. From both Tim and I, thank you to the Torch team for supporting us to host this conference. Thank you to all of you for attending, to all of those who submitted such wonderful poems. Well done again to the two winners, Harriet and Sarah. We hope this Deep Time in Humanities conference was useful, enjoyable, and helped look at the environment and deep time from many new perspectives. The recordings will be available on the Torch website and their YouTube channel once they've been edited, and a special edition of some of the papers will be published in the Worldviews journal next year, so keep an eye out for that. If you have any further questions or comments, you can email Tim or I at deeptimeox@gmail.com. That's deeptimeox@gmail.com. And thank you again for joining us. Have a good evening.